Hello, Professor Warner. Nice to see you.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Venit-Shelton.
Together apart, right?
Maybe,
Together apart.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
it's nice to be here, so to speak, talking about Westerns with you. This is something that, although you are a scholar of literature and I'm a historian, both of us are very much interested in the Hollywood Western. And we both teach Hollywood Westerns in our classes, and I think are generally in our private lives fans of Westerns.
absolutely. And we found out about this quite fortuitously, by
Yeah,
being on the administration committee a couple of years ago.
that's right. So, and tell me what appeals to you about the Western as a scholar? I mean, what do you think the Western, what is its importance for you in the work that you do?
Well, my first interest in the Western really just came from personal experience, and I have fond memories of watching Westerns as a kid with my uncle and my grandfather, and father, and just other family members. My grandmother, interestingly enough, who was a Russian refugee, loved Westerns and the landscapes that reminded her of her homeland in Russia, of the part of Russia she came from. But then once I became a scholar of literature, and film was always a strong interest of mine, I just was drawn to the powerful stories that the Western often tells. I think the setting of individuals making it in some way in that landscape, often a very beautiful but also harsh and threatening landscape, was fascinating to me. And it just seemed to me that the Western often strips away a lot of extraneous issues and really cuts to the core of human interactions in some ways. And uh, I began to see that the Western was actually more nuanced and more complex than I had thought it to be. And so those are some of the things that drew me to it. And also, I just think that as it happens, though there are wonderful films in all genres, I was struck by how many great films there really are in this particular genre.
Yeah, it's true. It's such a rich kind of text to work with. I think the genre of the Western in a way that it doesn't often get credit for, right? I think we have a sort of preconceived notion of, well, it's always the cowboy or it's always the shootout.
Right.
But within those kind of tropes, there's so much to kind of unpack and work with.
And a lot of variation
Yes.
within those tropes.
Yes, certainly.
That's one of the interesting things about the Western to me, is that it relies so much on these formulas.
Mm-hmm.
And, the sheriff, the good guy, the bad guy, horses, saloons, the dance hall girl, and so on, and homesteaders, and of course, the whole issue of Native Americans and
Right.
white settlers and so on. But it's the variations within those formulas that are so interesting. But when did you get interested in the Western?
Well, I did watch Westerns with my dad a lot, spaghetti Westerns. He was a big Clint Eastwood
Yeah.
fan. So I did grow up with them, watching them on television. But so my area of specialization in history is the American West. I have a regional specialization.
Right.
And so you kind of can't avoid them, at a certain point,
That's true.
no matter what you study. And I work on a
Right.
much earlier period. I work on the 19th century where there weren't films. But I was really kind of drawn to them because of the way they are part of a longer tradition of a frontier myth. This
Yes.
sort of myth of origins of what it is to be American as coming out of the zones of contact between people of European descent and indigenous people.
Yes.
And I would say that's a tradition that goes back at least to people like James Fenimore Cooper writing leather stocking tales in the early 19th century. So that was kind of more of a colonial frontier, not the far west. But honestly, I was thinking about it this morning, and a lot of what you see Puritans writing about in the 17th century when they're in Maine and Massachusetts, what's now Maine and Massachusetts, and kind of encountering Indians, is this kind of narrative of who am I? What does it mean to be me, or to be part of my community as defined through this sort of frontier encounters? So I like Western films because I think they continue this tradition of telling those stories about encounters and Americanness. I think they are really this kind of like quintessentially American art form. You can't imagine these stories taking place anywhere except in the Western fringe of the country.
That's this idea of self-definition and also national definition.
Yes.
Sure. It seems that at its root, the Western is often asking, what kind of people are we?
That's right. Yeah.
And what kind of people do we want to be?
I think
the more profound Westerns,
Yeah. And I think Stagecoach, we're going to talk about Stagecoach, I know today, but Stagecoach is really does just that. That for me, when I think about a text or a film like Stagecoach, it's really one of those genre defining films, that it is part of that long tradition of telling frontier stories. But I think it's also taking it in new directions, and as you're saying, it's a variation on many of those themes. So to me, that's why Stagecoach is such a kind of interesting text to pick apart and unpack, is because it does some things that feel very familiar, and then it does some things that are new and that are particular to its moment in being released in 1939.
Very much so. So many of the Westerns, too, are films about their period.
Yes.
And so you could go through the 50s and you see that in many ways those are about the 50s and about issues.
About the Cold War, right?
Cold War.
It becomes this, the Western becomes a great lens with which to think about issues of the Cold War, international issues, but also domestic issues, right? You see a lot of what's happening with race relations during the Cold War in the 1960s, kind of playing out through these tropes. And again, for me, it comes back to the way that the genre is really defining of what it is to be American. So if you're sort of in a moment where that national identity is contested, it's expanding or it's contracting, it's being challenged in any way, the Western becomes kind of a very familiar place to think through those issues.
Yes, thinking through them, and sometimes I think, you must have found this, that there's grist for your scholarly mill, so to speak, in Westerns whose ideology may be, anathema to your own. Or problematic, in some way.
Absolutely.
Which I also find, but I think that the Western is, in fact, a very interesting place to study issues like gender or issues like race, because sometimes even the absence of race can be very telling.
I think that's
What is this absence here that, with our present perspective on earlier Westerns, is a screaming kind of absence?
Yeah.
Or in what way are some presentations of an issue, so just for example, for women, I think that it's very interesting to me that there are two versions of the film 3:10 to Human. I don't want to get too much of a sidebar, but it's very pertinent to what you were saying.
Yeah.
So in the 1950s, the presentation of women in 3:10 to Human is very much domestic, the idea of the wife and the family, and that the husband is true to the wife and family and must do everything for them, and the faithful little woman, so to speak, is rewarded at the end of the film. However, it's not just that simplistic. It's not just some 1950s housewife stereotype.
Yeah.
Both the housewife and the saloon girl in that particular film in the 1950s version have a much bigger role than in the 2006 version, which is a great film too, but minimizes the importance of women. The women in the earlier film have more screen time, more dialogue, more close-ups, and more sense of their interior life and their pain and their happiness. So that at the same time that there is a sort of 50s homogenized home and family ideal that's perpetrated, the female characters, both of them, and there are only two in the film, have much more texture in 1957 than they did in 2006.
Right.
Fascinating. And yet 2006 is the age of, after women's liberation. So not to belabor that point, but those are some of the complexities and textures that I just find fascinating about the genre. But getting back to Stagecoach, it was genre defining.
Yeah.
Peter Bogdanovich, who who was a filmmaker himself and knew John Ford very well, calls it the first adult Western. So I think it is a very important moment. And this adult Western, just, the Western was going into sort of decline when it was made. David O. Selznick told John Ford, a Western, what do you want to make a Western? They're so hackneyed, such a B-movie kind of genre. But Ford insisted and pushed it through. And the result was, not a huge hit financially, though it did fairly well, but critically, it was a huge success. And of course, it paved the way for the dominance of the Western in the late 40s and 50s.
Right.
So,
And it made John Wayne's career. I mean,
absolutely.
John Wayne was not John Wayne until he played the Ringo Kid in Stagecoach.
Absolutely. You're right. Absolutely. That was a career that really redefined, it rejuvenated two careers.
Oh,
one
John
was
Ford, too?
Wayne's, or not rejuvenated, but really he had been in some, a lot of B movies,
Mm-hmm.
tens of movies already, or dozens of movies. But this really made him into John Wayne, and it rejuvenated Ford's career, which was okay, but a bit in the doldrums.
Yeah. Well, it's a film, I have taught it before, although it's been a number of years, but it's certainly one that I like revisiting again. Because as you're saying, it's so defining of the genre. It does so many things so expertly, right? And I'm really looking forward to talking to you, because I think as someone who comes from kind of a more of a literary tradition, right? Someone who's more attentive to form and aesthetics. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about it. And I want to make you talk about a scene that you told me once that you didn't really like very much, or maybe that I think you said it doesn't do very much for me, which is the Apache Chase scene.
Sure.
But
Right.
for me, this is, when I rewatch it, I don't know how many times I've seen Stagecoach at this point, but this is, to me, it still gives me the chills. Like, I still get that kind of thrill of watching that scene. And so I wanted to kind of compel you to talk about it, even if it might not be your first choice.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about your take on it, so I think that, to me, it's a little bit, and some other people comment on this, I think it's a little long. And I think that there are, to me, it's a little less interesting than some of the other scenes, because, you have the whooping Indians and the chase, the stagecoach rushing along. So it's not that I don't like the scene, but it's not one of my favorite scenes. It seems there the familiar trope of the stagecoach chase is not as fresh as it could be, though there are certainly elements of it that I find, very interesting. And it's got some great stunt work, and also I think that what happens in the interior of the stagecoach during the chase is, the banker's trying to get out of he's trying to get out of the coach, but and it seems totally unrealistic, but in a way he's hysterical, and has to get slugged in the jaw by the doc to simmer down.
And what about Hatfield? Hatfield almost murders Lucy, right?
That's a very
he has one bullet left.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that scene a little bit later on. I would like to actually talk about that.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell me about what is it that draws you so much to that particular scene?
Well, I think it gets back to kind of what I was saying about how I think about the Western as being part of this long tradition of frontier myths. And so this scene is going to happen from the very first frame of the movie, right? It has to happen. The moment of encounter has to happen. So, when John Ford makes Stagecoach, he sets it in the desert Southwest. That the Apache are going to show up, and that Geronimo is going to be their leader. Right. And to me, it's this sort of it reflects the place that Geronimo and the Apache had in American popular culture. Because Geronimo, who was in fact a warrior leader of the Apache, he had been a showman for most of his life. He was taken prisoner of war in the 1880s, spent some time in an American prison. But then after that, he became a traveling showman, and he traveled with Buffalo Bill Cody. He traveled all over the place performing Geronimo, like performing himself.
Right.
So part of what I love is that John Ford captures on film this much larger thing that's happening out on the road. He allows these actors to play Apache and to play Geronimo, very much in kind of like in keeping with the way that Apache warriors like Geronimo actually played themselves out on the circuit.
Yeah,
so that's kind of part of what I like about it. But I actually also like, I could kind of go on, and I do want to talk about the stunts, as you mentioned the stunts. But I also just think it's great that it's actually not the dramatic climax of the film. So like a traditional frontier myth, right? It would end with the defeat of the Apache. It would end with the cavalry charging and the order being restored in that way. But the movie goes on, and the climax is actually the shootout and the escape. So the Ringo Kid finally having his confrontation with the Plummer brothers, and then escaping with Dallas. So I think, to me, it's like the Apache chase scene happens, and it happens because it has to happen to fulfill the kind of tradition of the frontier myth and the kind of plotting of that. But then Ford does this really cool and interesting new thing where he makes another dramatic moment happen that is in fact more important. So I think for me, it's like a moment where he's playing with the genre in some interesting ways and trying to make it tell, in fact, a different story from what these like older frontier myths used to tell.
Which would have ended with the rescue of the stagecoach, the cavalry charging over the hill and wherever,
the
or through the desert.
Right? The rightness and justness of white conquest over the Indians. But instead, he makes it about this sort of story of redemption. I think it goes back to being a film about the 1930s. Like, who are the heroes in this movie? It's the outlaw and the prostitute, these people who are really quite downtrodden, just as people in the 1930s were starting to kind of rethink, like, where's the moral center of our country? It's not with these sort of plutocrats and the bankers and the elite. It's really with the ordinary people, the people who have suffered maybe the most. And so I think the film is trying to kind of move the Western, as you said, I've never heard that it's the first adult Western, but I think it is trying to make it like more complex and more kind of critical of American society.
Yes, definitely there's that element. And I think that there's so many things that you have in what you're saying. The real villain of the piece, or is the banker, and the Ringo Kid, who has been in the pen and who is, the criminal is actually the good guy.
Right.
And you have the prostitute with the heart of gold, and yet she's more nuanced and complex as well. And I think that comes through a lot in the formal aspects of the way that she's shot, and certain lines that she has. It's a great script by Dudley Nichols, who was a really great Hollywood screenwriter. But I think that the way that Ford doesn't end there is just so significant. And, he has a resolution at the end. I mean, there is a wonderful resolution. Peacock survives the arrow wound.
Mm-hmm.
The Gatewood is arrested, and it's so satisfying that he's arrested, And you have, Curly and Doc Boone, letting Ringo escape and go down across the border. And I just love it, and the opening theme, the music is not, as it's often identified, Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie, although it sounds a little bit like it. It's really a much more upbeat song with a similar melody. It's The Trail to Mexico.
Oh my God.
And at the end, Ringo does go to Mexico. That's very much thematically associated with him. Just like the theme of the old Stephen Foster Southern melancholy ballad, I Dream of Jeannie, is associated with Lucy Mallory. And again and again, when she comes on, you'll hear that motif, da 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 da, which in 1939 would be very familiar to people with no education whatsoever. People who maybe hadn't even finished high school. Just, your average American Joe would know, oh, that's I Dream of Jeannie.
Yeah, yeah. I think
And so
there's
it's
so much of
associated
that.
with her and the Soul South.
Mhm.
And so going back to the Stagecoach scene, that scene where that you mentioned in the scene, I think that's one of the most interesting things about the interior drama in the Stagecoach. I mean, I rewatched that scene, and I got to say I enjoyed it more after, thanks to your suggestion about it, because you have the exterior, you have the interior,
Mhm.
and the cutting back between the two,
Yeah.
and the interior drama of it. And of course, Hatfield is about to kill Lucy Mallory as a mercy killing because she's going to escape the fate worse than death, which is to be seized and violated by the Indians. But of course, fortunately, he gets killed himself instead, so she survives. But that allows her the irony. There's so many ironies there. The guy who has the most esteem for her is the one who's going to kill her. The Ringo Kid would never kill her.
Right.
That was that situation. He'd find some other way to do it, but he's not going to kill her. He would never do that, because for him, well, there's no fate worse than death. You just, you got to live. And it's very interesting that earlier in the film, Dallas says you got to live, no matter what. And so he's about to kill her to spare her honor, but ironically, of course, he that is killed before he could do that. But then in a later irony, we learned that just a few seconds later, the cavalry is going to occur and what's so interesting is that this character, frosty and cold and mean to Dallas, also is shown to be not just a caricature. There's this more human side to her. It's very fitting that she's the one who hears the cavalry because she's so attuned to her husband. She's the ideal military wife, in a sense. And while there are certain limitations to her humanity, Ford shows us how appropriate it is that she, of all people, would be attuned to hearing the bugle amidst the din of battle, and that she understands what that means, that the cavalry is coming. I find it a very touching scene because this mean woman, this cold woman, this limited woman, I mean, we are just supposed to hate her in that luncheon scene when she's looking at Dallas that way. But she's a human being, and she has her complexities as well. And she's the one who hears the bugle call. So I loved it.
Yeah, no, I never think about Lucy Mallory. And when I watch this movie, that's so interesting. I always think of her as being kind of the foil to Dallas, and Dallas is who our sympathies are with. But I think you're right. In that moment, with the close-up of her face,
yes,
we're really meant to kind of invest in her, right? And be in tune with her.
Yeah. Just for a few seconds at least.
Yes.
Yes.
And then right back to Dallas.
Yeah.
But what do you think? So the other thing when I watched this Stagecoach scene is that, and you mentioned it, it's the stunts. I mean, to me, one of the thrilling things about it is that it is an archive. I mean, it's a motion picture archive of rodeo trick riding. The lead stunt coordinator and the person that you actually see playing John Wayne and playing kind of some principal Apache warriors is a man named Yakima Canut, right? That's a stage name. Yakima is not his real name, but he named himself after, I think, the part of Washington where he was from.
Right.
He was a rancher. Yes. And then he was a professional bronco rider, and he came to Hollywood and basically developed all of these techniques and equipment associated with the horseplay that you see. So to me, watching it, it's really getting a kind of glimpse into this Western rodeo tradition. It's preserving it in a kind of archive. Yes. And it's amazing. I mean, it's not CGI, right? We have to say this, right. I think, to this generation of audience, that those are real people doing those tricks and not computer graphics.
I think I mentioned to you that some students were incredulous and in fact asked, how did they do that shot? How did they do that scene?
Where he climbs over the horses and drops down below.
A real human being who did that.
Yeah.
And they had to make sure that the Stagecoach was traveling at top speed,
right,
so that the wheels wouldn't wobble. Yeah. Because any wobbling of the wheel, you get hit on the side of the head with a wheel like that. You're going to be completely mangled.
Yeah.
And it's a real human being, so it was pretty risky. He was really risking his life.
Oh yeah, and I heard that they only did one take. That John Ford after that was like, no, we're not doing that again. We're not risking that again.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was him. And I think like again, I think this kind of gets to this for me when I'm watching this historian. It's this window onto a much larger tradition. So Western rodeo, where Yakima came out of, right? This sort of circuit of rodeo riders. It was this extraordinarily diverse place. So he actually learned a lot of his techniques from an African-American rodeo rider named Bill Picken, who was the one who basically developed the technique of wrestling a steer to the ground.
Oh, wow.
He traveled with Jackson Sundown,
I didn't know that.
Nez rodeo rider. So Yakima Kennett, who's this white guy from Washington, was really displaying in this film all of these traditions that were developed by indigenous writers, Hispanic writers, Black writers, and then it's not visible in the film unless you know to look for it. But if it were not for these films, so much of that tradition we would never see. You know, we would never have a record of it in the way that Stagecoach becomes a record of it.
And that really is an interesting dimension to the film that sort of blends together what happens in the story, but also the story outside of the story, and preserves that.
Right.
And so that, I think, is where you as a historian really provide a wonderful lens in a way that sort of broadens the whole experience of this film.
Yeah, I think historians often with film are not thinking, as you were describing, of that form or even the characterization. I never really thought about that sort of sensitivity to the way that the director is presenting these characters and their interiority. But historians are very interested in the materiality of film production. So who is making it? Where are they making it?
Yes.
Under what conditions? And all that kind of context that shapes what we eventually are able to see on the screen, right?
You know, there's a little bit of that that's emerging in literary studies now when you talk about paratextual studies, or the paratext, the book itself, but also who is the publisher, what is the book covering, what is the materiality of the book, is it leather bound, how big are the margins, you know, what's the advertising campaign that's associated with it. And in a way, there's a paratextual world for film too. The advertising of the film, the posters, the titles that are given to a film in other languages. How that becomes an index to that film's interaction with that culture to a certain extent. And what you're describing, Tamara, is just, fascinating to me. So again, I think that the historian's perspective and the film person's perspective they're not the same, clearly. And I think that you approach it in one way and I approach it in the other way, but they are also not oppositional, but rather they're complementary. And I think that they can really draw on one another and create a richer experience overall. So I really think that looking at film in terms of history, the history about the period that the film is set in, but also the history in which the film was made. You've mentioned the 1930s, for example, the Depression era. This is very much a film of the Depression era. And then that, in addition to all of the formal nuances within the film and visual patterns, the pairing off of different characters, Dallas and Ringo and Hatfield and Lizzie Mallory and Doc Boone and Mr. Peacock, all of these formal characteristics of the film and the larger context of the film and the historical references of the film, all of these things really are part of a whole. But you get at it, as a historian, you have to have a certain angle of approach. And as a literary person or film person, I have to have a certain angle of approach. You could draw from those other resources. But I never knew that about the background, that actually it was an African-American writer who had taught Yakima those things that he then passed on. So in a way, at several removes, that film is a tribute to those unsung heroes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like this might be a good place to conclude. I think you really nicely summarized kind of our different approaches to the Western and to Stagecoach in particular. Yeah.
Well, it's been delightful. Always glad to find an excuse to talk about Stagecoach.
I know. Any excuse. All right.
Thank you so much, Tamara.
Thank you.